Hey there! In this video, I'm going to show you how I paint my Grey Knights. If you've ever watched any of my videos or seen any of my posts on Reddit or Instagram or somewhere, you know that I have a particular way that I like to paint Grey Knights. I typically am not a fan of the bluish bright steel color that Games Workshop tends to use for their Grey Knights. I tend to go with something a little bit darker. The method I use is consistent across my whole army for infantry, vehicles, dreadnoughts and stuff, and even the bigger vehicles like land raiders. The first step is obviously assembling the miniature. For this video, I've chosen to put together a Terminator Justicar with a Nemesis Demon Hammer. I don't have enough heavy weapons for dealing with tanks and things, so I figured I'd use another. Make sure you trim off all the mold lines, all that kind of stuff. Important, and I see a lot of people miss this, make sure you draw the barrels. I didn't do an even job here, but make sure it's done. It pulls the whole model together. The next step is to prime the entire thing with GW's Chaos Black. I strongly recommend Chaos Black for this rather than some other primers. I have a note on my desk specifically telling me to avoid a very certain primer. When you're priming, make sure you do turn the model over, lay it on its side, on its front and its back to spray everything, and make sure you get every nook and cranny. The black undercoat is very important with my method here. And after you've got that nice, even black primer, you're ready to do the first paint on here, which is going to be lead belcher. I'm not going to be applying lead belcher in the traditional sense in that I'm not going to be like using my normal brush and painting layer by layer. What I'm going to be doing is something that I've called heavy dry brushing. I don't know if this is an actual technique, but it's what I do. Anyway, I get most of the paint off of the brush before I start applying anything to the miniature, and then I just do my typical dry brushing techniques. You'll see that I'm going over all the big armor panels, making sure I grab anything that's going to be silver on the Grey Knight with lead belcher. Important here, and the reason that I'm doing the dry brushing is to avoid getting silver into the very, very nooks and crannies, all the little black edges and crevices within it. It's going to keep a lot of contrast and make it really look like there's a lot of deep shadow without having to do too much specific shading with Nuln Oil or something like that. So again, just a heavy dry brush across the whole thing. Yeah, he looks great. The next step is just drenching the entire model in Drakenhof Nightshade. Don't be shy. I just literally take a thicker brush, I dip it into the Drakenhof, and then just start slapping it on there. Not even being shy. It's falling into all the crevices. It's filling everything up. I do make sure that if anything is pooling anywhere, I either take a drier brush or a paper towel and take off all the pooling liquid just so it doesn't get that gross, muddy, shaded feel to it. But overall, I am just soaking the entire thing in Drakenhof. Once you've got the Drakenhof on, it's time to just let them dry for a bit. It is pretty soaking wet, so it's going to take a while to dry, so you might as well go work on some other projects in the meantime. I'm currently using a bunch of aquarium plants and gravel and things to make a bunch of jungle scatter terrain for a new board, which I'm excited about using. Once the Drakenhof is dry, I take lead belcher again, and we're going to go over with another dry brush. It's going to be lighter this time, more of a traditional dry brush. I'm going to get a lot more of the paint off of my brush than I had before. I'm going to go over mostly just the larger armor panels. I'm going to try to get the whole model with this, but ideally I'm keeping the recesses darker and the undersides of him, like under the crotch or on the underside of the legs or the underside of the arms, those kinds of things, keeping that darker silver, the toned down Drakenhof silver. But over the top and on the larger armor panels, we're going to be going over again with lead belcher. What we get here is a nice, solid, shaded silver across the entire thing. But we're not quite done yet. The next step for the armor is to take Grey Knight steel in a very small amount, just a tiny bit onto the brush. I'm going to be doing an actual dry brush here, which means barely any paint, and then I'm just barely touching the model as I get any of the parts where light would hit. I usually imagine a light source from above, so the tops of the shoulder pads, the tops of the arms, top of his helmet, maybe a knee pad or two that's sticking out from underneath him, depending on the pose, the back piece, but pretty much anything that the sun would hit if it were directly overhead. Again, it's a very, very, very light touch of Grey Knight steel on there. Not a whole lot, just enough to give a shine. And the last step for the armor itself is to highlight with Stormhole Silver. Just very, very, very faint highlight on all the sharpest edges. So on the gorget, onto the shoulder pads again, maybe onto the fingers just to give some definition there. But largely, you're not going to be using a lot of this. Just very, very tips. Again, anywhere that the light will be hitting from above. The ultimate effect of the armor is one that I'm really fond of. It isn't the bright kind of 80s style silver that a lot of Grey Knights are. It is a mostly dark, relatively downplayed, muted effect that's still shiny at points and still stands out from other Space Marines. With the armor done, I move on to the other metallics. First, I use Retributor Gold to get all of the lettering and all of the symbols and little decorations across him. Don't worry about painting each individual little letter on his armor. Just paint the entire bit gold, and the letters will pop out once we get a shade on there later. Once the Retributor Gold is done, I go through with a Balthazar Gold as the next metallic, just to get all the points that are shiny and need to stand out but aren't going to be as prominent as the golden decoration. This is the pommel of the Nemesis Demon Hammer, some of the mechanics on the servo skull, various little points, the brass plaque on his shoulder, that kind of thing. After that, you need to look around your messy paint space for the pot of Iron Warriors that you're pretty sure your buddy left at your place a year ago. Ah, there it is, of course. Iron Warriors is a lovely little paint. It's darker than Leadbelcher, so you can put it on the pieces of the Grey Knight that are supposed to be metallic, like the Stormbolter, or maybe the joints, or maybe a few pistons or rods, things like that. It'll really help it stand out, especially once it's shaded as being like mechanical, as opposed to the silver that the armor is. Thin out the Iron Warriors and paint it onto the metallic parts of the Stormbolter behind the casing, which are going to remain black. While you're doing this, listen to your wife tell you you're an alcoholic. Did I? Where'd it go?
You drank it?
Did I drink it all?
Yes.
Oh. Oops.
You go through like a bottle of whiskey a week.
I don't go through a bottle of whiskey a week. I can't have... Did I really drink all of that?
Yeah.
Holy shit. Oh, all right. Well, I guess I'll... It's good I bought more. Next, get a pot of corn red and be furious, because demons. Paint the red onto the haft of the Nemesis Demon Hammer and onto the shields and crunch. And crunch is the one that's on the shoulder. Tilt shield. The smaller shields on the heraldry. There we go. Onto his heraldry, depending on how you're going to pattern it. I have my half and half pattern that I always do on them. And while I'm thinking about red, I get out my Galvorbach red, the Word Bearers one, and I paint the purity seals, the wax parts of the purity seals, and the outside of all the little books on the chest and the shoulder, things like that. Moving swiftly on, I'm going to take Screaming Skull and paint the pages of the books and the ribbon cloths of the purity seals, and I'm going to take Ulthuan Grey, which is the only white I ever use, and paint the other halves of the shields in crunches, tilt shields, heraldry. At this point, it's all detail work. We've gotten through the big parts with the armor and everything. It's just all small details. A little bit of Macragge blue for tubes and whatnot. And this next step is subtle, but really important for breaking up the stark silver of the armor. I take the Black Templar's contrast paint and I paint it over the joints, the little tube-looking areas between his upper legs and his lower legs, around his hips, in his arms, his elbows, that kind of thing. It makes it look like there is genuinely like an undersuit there, and it, again, breaks up the armor a lot. Then comes my favorite part, which is shading. I don't know why I enjoy shading so much, but I really do. So I take Agric's Earthshade, and I start putting it all over everything that isn't silver armor. The skulls, the tubes, the wiring, the gold, the paper, the red, the purity seals, everything gets a little, very concentrated, very purposeful wash of Agric's Earthshade. Now he's going to be really wet again. All the silver's fine, but everything else, as you can see, is just dripping with Agric's Earthshade. Let him dry for a while. Go do something else. Maybe return to that other project that you're working on while you let this single tiny figure dry. The next step is the eyes, which requires the utmost precision. Just get the tiniest bit of Lothern blue onto the tip of your paintbrush and just do one layer over it. Get it a little again, make sure it's thinned out, and do another one right over the top of it. As you can see, I kind of messed up a little bit here. I got some on the rim of the mouth part of his helmet, but I'll go back with some silver later and fix that up. It can always be fixed up. Following that is the most technically accurate and trickiest and surgical part of the whole thing, but also the most important for making the model really, really pop. And there we go. Just one little dot. That's it, to make him look like he's got glowing eyes. And for the servo skull as well. There we go. Look at that. The next step is doing all of his scroll work. I've got 3 micron pens that I use for that. Black, red, and brown of varying sizes. I tend to like the 01s or the 05s. They're very precise without being too faint. I use the brown and the red to do the scroll work on the purity seals and on the books, and I use the black for the iconography on the shoulder, which for me is an Inquisition eye. And another little trick that I like to do for black, particularly on gun casings and machinery and things, is I take the side of a pencil and I just run it along the edges. It gives it kind of a little silver, I guess, lead highlight onto the edges of the casings, which I think really makes them look mechanical, makes them look more like worn machinery, and especially with like Abaddon black like I use here, really makes them pop, really makes them stand out. And that's about it, honestly. Additionally, I did the base for this dude, and I did a new technique with the Nemesis Demon Hammer that I really like how it turned out. But those were experimental for me. Primarily, though, yeah, once you get the basics of the armor down, then you just start doing the detail work, wash the entire thing, and it turns out great. And you have a nice, darkish, silver little Grey Knight who looks like he's ready to step onto some alien planet and start killing demons, which hopefully I'll get to do this weekend. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it gave you some insight into how I paint my guys, and maybe you learned something. I need to think of a closing statement for my videos. Like, share, subscribe, die.